Good morning, afternoon, or evening. Welcome to the Chapter 4 practice problem video. I have a fairly short set for Chapter 4 because all the main concepts kind of fit into a couple nice concise problems here. So I was going to start with exercise 4-1 in your text, and then we'll jump ahead just a little bit. 4.1 said Quality Brick Company produces bricks in 2 processing departments, molding and firing. Information relating to the operations in March is shown here in letters A through F. And for these activities, or transactions if you will, we're going to prepare some journal entries. So right off the bat here, letter A said raw materials used in production, molding department 23,000, firing department 8,000. Now thinking back to chapter 3 and what you read about in chapter 4 already, a lot of our cost flows in our process costing system are very, very similar to what they were in our job order costing system. So we'll try to make sure we provide some extra emphasis here on the differences. And so letter A highlights one of those. Remember, in our job order costing system, we only had one work in process account. And now in our process costing system, we've got a work in process account for every processing department. So that makes the journal entries and the flow of the costs look a little different here. So A said again, raw materials used in production, molding 23,000, firing 8,000. So we're going to want to book a debit to work in process for the molding department to reflect the 23,000 in raw materials used there. And then we also want now a debit to work in process in the firing department for the 8,000 materials that we used there. Now, in terms of recognizing the usage of all those materials, we can condense that to one credit to the raw materials account for the total of those two. And again, I'll try to be consistent here and do these calculations out explicitly so that we're not kind of jumbling numbers or cell references here. So 23,000 plus 8,000 means we used a total of 31,000 in materials. Letter B said direct labor costs incurred, molding department 12,000, firing department 7,000. Very similar here to the letter A entry in that we're recognizing direct costs. So we're going to stick that in the work in process accounts for the two separate processing departments here. And again, the molding department had 12,000 in direct labor incurred. Over in firing there was 7,000. So that's a total of 19,000. And in terms of a matching credit, it just says incurred, necessarily paid it yet. So any kind of wages payable or payroll payable type account is perfectly fine there. Now in letter C, manufacturing overhead was applied. Again, 25,000 to the molding department for work that's been done there throughout the period, and 37,000 over in the firing department for the work we've done in that department. So overhead is always applied to work in process. That's the same as it was in our job order costing system. So once again, we've got work in process molding and work in process firing, and we're booking debits to those accounts for 25,000 and 37,000 respectively. So the total here, 62,000. We need our matching credit. And this was applied overhead, so we want to credit that manufacturing overhead account. Okay, remember, credits to overhead are applied overhead. Debits to overhead would be to recognize actual or incurred overhead. Just a few more. D said unfired molded bricks were transferred from the molding department to the firing department. According to the costing system, the cost of those bricks was $57,000. So now we're showing the movement of goods through our production process, similar to what we've been doing in our job order costing system, only now we're passing them in between two processing departments. So we're going to say work in process firing is increasing by the bricks that are being passed, 57,000. Where are they coming from? Well, they're coming from the work in process account in that molding department, same 57,000. Okay, so this entry is one we would not see at all in a job order costing system. We wouldn't be passing between work in process accounts because we only have one. we will see this type of entry in our process costing system. Letter E said finished bricks were transferred from the firing department to the finished goods warehouse. According to the process costing system, cost of those finished bricks was $103,000. So this one very similar to what we did last chapter as well. Now these things are done and ready to sell. So we need to increase that finished goods account by the $103,000. And then we want to credit the work in process account from the last step along the line. In this case, that's the firing department. So credit that $103,000. And then last but not least, letter F said finished bricks were sold to customers. According to the company's process costing system, the cost of the finished bricks sold was $101,000. So that's a cost to the company, not what we're charging the customer. So let's just worry about updating the inventory there. Now the costs associated with these things, these inventoriable costs, these product costs, finally gets to hit the income statement. We get a debit to cost of goods sold for $101,000, and we get a credit to that finished goods inventory account for the same $101,000. And again, this entry almost identical to what we'd see in our job order costing system in our previous chapters. All right, I'm going to jump ahead now to exercise 4-2. Get some practice in on this new concept for us in chapter 4, equivalent units of production. And by the way, we are only sticking to the weighted average method here, so that's why I didn't assign the appendix from this chapter. So 4.2 said Clonix uses the weighted average method in its process costing system. Following data here is available for some department in October, so we know beginning and ending work in process, as well as the percent completed with respect to materials and conversion. We also know the department started 175,000 units into production during this month and transferred 190,000 completed units to the next department. We want to come up with the equivalent units of production for October. So the first thing I'll say here is it's a great idea to get in the habit of always calculating equivalent units with respect to materials and conversions separately. Okay, we always want to think about that when we're thinking about equivalent units. Remember, they represent essentially the equivalent full completed units with respect to these separate costs, materials and conversion being labor and overhead. So we want to stay in that habit of calculating this separately for those two categories. So equivalent units of production, we always start with the units completed and transferred because those things are 100% done with respect to everything, right? Otherwise they wouldn't be transferred out of the department. So always counting those at 100% here. So in this case, we were explicitly told 190,000 units were completed and moved on to the next department. So with respect to materials and conversion, that's 190,000 in each case. Now to that, I want to add the ending work in process. And here's where I want to do a little math to figure out what the equivalent units were in that ending work in process. Let's start with respect to materials. 15,000 physical units were an ending work in process. With respect to materials, they're 80% complete. So we're going to count those at 80% of the 15,000. With respect to conversion, it's the same 15,000 physical units, but they're only 40% complete with respect to conversion. Oops. All kinds of typos here. I'm just going to leave that in because I don't mind looking, human for a moment. Okay, so we'll do the math out here. We're saying 15,000 again times the 80% with respect to materials. Over here for conversion, 15,000 times that 40%, and there we are with 6,000 equivalent units. So then the total equivalent units of production for the period in the department becomes the sum of the units completed and transferred plus the equivalent units in the ending work in process there. 12,000 with respect to materials. And then over here for conversion, the 6,000 instead. Okay, so equivalent units of production, always units completed and transferred plus the equivalent units in the ending work in process there. Remember, we don't have to mess around with the beginning inventory in any way because we're using that weighted average method. They're all being blended together essentially. So that's it for 4-2. Okay, now I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to exercise 4-6. Oh, and quick reminder here, I'll try to throw this in from time to time. All the solutions for all of the back of chapter problems are available on our Canvas site. So if you're doing extra ones for practice, which I highly encourage you to, as your schedule permits, you certainly have access to those, so you don't have to wonder if you're on the right track. You can check your work there. Okay, so 4-6 said Highlands Company uses this weighted average method in its process costing system. It processes wood pulp to make a bunch of different paper products. Here's some data related to tons of pulp processed in June. So we've got the beginning and ending work in process. We know it was started into production. And then we know percent completion for beginning and ending work in process with respect to materials. And then labor and overhead, which is just another way to say conversion in that same period. So the first requirement said, come up with the number of tons of pulp that were completed and transferred. So we're doing sort of a little bit of inventory flow to figure out what happened there. Well, we started with 20,000 tons of pulp in beginning work in process. We started into production 190,000. Okay, so 20,000 plus the 190,000. That would represent the total tons that we were working on at any point during the period. So if I take away from that the 30,000 that were still in work in process at the end of the period, the difference must be what I completed and transferred out of this department in that month. So again, beginning plus what I dumped into the process minus what's still there in work in process at the end of the period, I must have completed and transferred 180,000 tons. Okay, so now equivalent units. Let's go ahead and make sure we're sticking to our thing here of doing this with respect to materials and conversion separately. Once again, we are starting with units completed and transferred. We're counting those at 100% with respect to everything. We just determined that was 180,000 tons. To that, we're going to add that ending work in process. We know that that's 30,000 physical units, or tons, physical tons of pulp in this case. Those things are 60% complete with respect to materials, and then 40% with respect to conversion, or labor plus overhead. So equivalent units in ending work in process with respect to materials. One more time, 30,000 times the 60%, or 18,000. Then over here with respect to conversion, 30,000 tons times the 40%, or an equivalent of 12,000. So now our equivalent units of production, taking the units completed and transferred, plus the equivalent units in the ending work in process. So for materials, 180 plus the 18, or 198,000. For conversion, the 180 plus the 12,000, and that leaves us with 192,000. All right, I had one more to cover here, and this was a sort of comprehensive end-to-end type deal. So this is 4-11. And I'll try to keep as much of it on the screen here as I can. I apologize for the scrolling, but I think it works best if I can leave enough space to show all the work here. So this one said Scribner's produces fine papers in 3 production departments: pulping, drying, and finishing. In pulping, raw materials such as wood fiber and rag cotton are treated to separate their fibers. Then they send it over to drying, where they lay it out to turn it into the big sheets. And then in finishing, they turn it into the real finished paper. So they use weighted average method in process costing. We've got a bunch of information about what happened in March here related to beginning and ending work in process, things that were added to the process or transferred to the next production department, as well as the cost associated with these things. We also know that no materials are added in drying, Pulping cost represents the cost of the wet fibers transferred in from pulping. Wet fibers processed in drying in batches. So each unit in this table above here is a batch. And a batch of wet fibers makes a set amount of dried paper that gets sent over to finishing. So sometimes helpful too to think about the process of these things and what's being made and how it's being done. The first thing we want to do is come up with the drying department's equivalent units of production for pulping and conversion in March. So pulping, not necessarily an exact same way to say materials, but we can think of the cost categories synonymously for now if we'd like, just to kind of ease this transition. Equivalent units of production, we are always starting with our units completed and transferred. Now in this case, we know that the units transferred to this next department, which was finishing, I believe, were 157,000. So we don't have to do any math this time to come up with that number. To that, we're going to add the ending work in process. Now that is 8,000 units. And those things are 100% done with respect to pulping and just 25% done with respect to that conversion costs. So here, equivalent units in ending work in process for pulping is 8,000. And just to be explicit here, I'll say times the 100%. It's just 8,000. And then over here in conversion, 8,000 times 25% or 2,000. So now my equivalent units of production with respect to pulping becomes the 157,000 completed and transferred, plus the 8,000 equivalent units there in ending work in process. Similar deal with conversion, 157 plus the 2,000 now in ending work in process, equivalent units. And there's equivalent units of 159,000. Next up said, come up with the drying department's cost per equivalent unit for pulping and conversion. Okay, so cost per equivalent unit. So always keep in mind too that this cost per equivalent unit, it gives you that nice little hint of per equivalent unit in case we were starting here. It would be a nice reminder that we have to come up with that equivalent units of production first. Right? So you don't want to worry about cost per physical unit. Always want to think about cost per equivalent unit. So trying to really measure the amount of work we've done in terms of those whole units and then what it cost us. Okay, so with our weighted average methods for blending all this stuff together, at least metaphorically or theoretically, this cost per equivalent unit with respect to pulping can be determined by the pulping costs that were in the beginning work in process when we entered this period. So right here, 4,800, plus all the pulping cost added during the period. Down here, 102,450. So that represents the total pulping cost of anything we've touched this period, essentially. The costs that were already there when we started the period, plus all the costs we dumped in during this period. Okay, so cost of beginning work in process, plus cost added during the period. Now divide that by our equivalent units of production with respect to pulping, and our cost per equivalent unit with respect to pulping, 65 cents. Same idea with conversion here. We've got the conversion cost and beginning work in process, only $500. We added conversion costs during March of $31,300. So all of our conversion costs, beginning work in process plus what we added, divided by the equivalent units with respect to conversion. And there we are at a nice even 20 cents per equivalent unit. One thing we did in chapter 4 here was we also came up with a total cost per equivalent unit, and there was nothing fancy there. It was just the cost per equivalent unit with respect to the two cost categories added together. Okay, so if we needed that information for anything, there it is, just the 65 plus the 20 or 85 cents. Okay, now part 3 said, compute the drawing department's cost of ending work in process inventory for pulping, conversion, and in total. So this is cost of ending work in process. Now we've done all the heavy lifting here, so this becomes a little bit mechanical. We want to take that cost per equivalent unit with respect to pulping, 65 cents, times the equivalent units in ending work in process with respect to pulping, excuse me. Okay, so 65-cent cost per times the equivalent units in ending work in process of 8,000, and there's our cost in ending work in process with respect to pulping. Same thing for conversion. 20 cents is the cost per equivalent unit times the 2,000 equivalent units that are in ending work in process. And there's our 400 bucks. So then the total is just the sum of those two. And it's worth pointing out here, if we looked at the work in process account for this department, the drawing department, we would see at the end of this period $5,600. That would be the cost of ending work in process. Okay, next up it said compute the drawing department's cost of units transferred out to the finishing department for pulping, conversion, and in total. It's cost of units transferred. Not much to this one either beyond what we've already done. We already know the cost per equivalent unit, 65 cents, times the units completed and transferred. Okay, remember that's the same as the equivalent units because those are 100% done with respect to everything. So 65 cents times 157,000 with respect to pulping, 102,050 bucks. Conversion, cost per equivalent unit 20 cents times 157,000 units transferred, 31,400. And then the total would just be the sum of those two, 133,450. And think about what kind of entry we would see there. This is going from the drawing department to the finishing department. So we'd have work in process finishing 133,450, work in process drying 133,450. And we would see an entry like that at kind of the end of the month or during the period that totaled out to this amount right here. Okay, so the very last thing wanted us to put together a cost reconciliation report for the drawing department for March. If you want to pause and review that conceptually for a moment, that's fine. Remember, our cost reconciliation report, we're just trying to say, what are all the costs I should be able to account for that have been part of this process, and then where'd they all go? So typically that first part will be the costs to be accounted for. And for our purposes, that's typically from two sources. We've got the cost of the beginning work in process, and then we've got cost added to production during the period. So let's talk about what belongs where here. Cost of beginning work in process, typically we'll condense this to one line across our two cost categories. So what I'm saying is there we had pulping cost and beginning work in process of $4,800, and we had conversion cost and beginning work in process of $500. So I'll just add them together. Total cost of beginning work in process $5,300. Same idea for cost added to production. We added $102,450 in pulping, and we added $31,300 in conversion cost. So a total there of $133,750. So let's get a grand total, $5,300 plus the $133,750 means my total costs to be accounted for equal $139,050. Now I just want to show where those went. Okay, so cost accounted for, where'd they go? In two destinations, right? We've got costs of units completed and transferred, I'll abbreviate here, And then we've got that costs of ending work in process. Now we've already done the heavy lifting in parts 3 and 4 for this, so I'm going to pull some numbers down. The cost of units completed and transferred we determined was $102,050 for pulping, $31,400 for conversion, for a total of $133,450. And similarly, we could determine the cost of ending work in process, $5,200 pulping, $400 conversion, or a total of $5,600. So my total costs accounted for become the sum of those two buckets, $133,450 plus $5,600, and assuming we've pulled the numbers down correctly here, this should total $139,050. Again, the sole purpose of that cost reconciliation report to reconcile all the costs that have been moving about through this process. Top part, where'd they come from? Beginning work in process plus what we added. Bottom part, where did they go? Some were associated with the units completed and transferred. Some still sitting there in that ending work in process. Okay, that's it for our Chapter 4 practice. As always, make sure you review any you want to see a second time or think more about. Try some other practice problems on your own, and let me know if you have any questions. Until next time.